from John 12, starting at the first verse. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honour. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, a keeper of the money bag. He used to help himself to what was put in it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me.
I normally finish writing my sermon on Thursday afternoon. That gives me a little bit of time to think, pray, edit leading up to Sunday. I often record my sermon and then listen back while walking frisbee. I ask him what he thinks. No, I don't. But I listen to it back and things come to mind that I think, actually, I'm not sure about that. And one thing I always check is to see if the sermon speaks to me, addresses me before I share it with you. That's all part of my preparation, and it does change, and it even changes in this moment as we're gathered here as well, because there's things I might add in or take away. But let me tell you that this week things didn't go according to plan at all. Already on Thursday, I could tell that my sermon was missing something. It was not very compelling to me. It was not very compelling. And that was a problem, because I find this story from John's Gospel about Mary, Jesus, Judas, I find it very compelling. But for some reason I was struggling to get to the heart of that in my sermon. So I threw the whole thing away. And I took Friday off as usual. And then I woke up at 5 on Saturday morning. I did some centering prayer, silent prayer. And then I wrote and wrote and wrote. And to make sure I didn't lose focus, I kept one question before me. Why do I love this story? Why do I love this story? And of course, it's not about me. Please, it's not about me. It's about you and it's about God. But I think I'm doing you a disservice if I'm not witnessing to what I find very compelling about this story in the context of my relationship with God. So why do I love this story? I'm just going to jump straight in. Because Jesus defends Mary. Mary pours out this expensive perfume on Jesus. Judas objects to the apparent waste. And then Jesus defends Mary. Leave her alone. It reminds me of a few chapters back in John's Gospel when some teachers of the law and Pharisees bring a woman caught in adultery to Jesus and ask him whether they should, according to the law, stone her. And what did he say to them? He said, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." He essentially says, leave her alone. And we might think of an episode in Luke's Gospel where Jesus defends the same Mary that is in our reading. Mary's sister, Martha, is hosting Jesus, making lots of preparations, and Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to his teaching. And Martha asks Jesus, "Get Mary to help me." Jesus doesn't. he defends Mary and says, Mary has chosen what is better. Then we might think of near identical stories, a collection of stories in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, where these people, they bring little children to Jesus for him to put his hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples rebuke them. Jesus defends the people with the children. I wonder if they're women. Perhaps they are, perhaps not. It doesn't say, but it does say what Jesus says, let the little children come to me and do not hinder them. Jesus defends. And in all of these examples, he's defending women and children from religious people, often from his own disciples. This is who Jesus is. This is who God is. Is Jesus still defending people today? Have you sensed Jesus defending you? And now over to us, Worthing Baptist Church. Who is being rebuked and threatened and turned away from Jesus today? Over to you. Who will you defend with Jesus? So why do I love this story? Because Jesus defends Mary. Why else do I love this story? Because the woman has a name. In this story, the woman who pours perfume on Jesus' feet is called Mary. And that might not seem like a big thing. Everyone has a name. And this woman's name was Mary. But there are other very similar stories to this one in Mark's Gospel and in Luke's Gospel. And in both of these accounts, the woman who pours the perfume on Jesus is unnamed. So in Luke's Gospel, the woman is called, wait for it, a woman in that town who lived a sinful life. That is the closest she gets to a name. John's Gospel doesn't mention any of that. John's Gospel says that the woman was Mary, sister of Martha and Lazarus, a beloved disciple of Jesus. In Mark's Gospel, the woman is called, wait for it, a woman. That's it. That's all we have. And do you know what makes it even worse? Is that after Jesus defends her in Mark's Gospel, he says to his disciples, truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. In memory of her. So wherever the gospel of Jesus Christ is preached, we are supposed to remember this woman. But in Mark's Gospel, she has no name. I just picture the Gospel writer Mark sitting down to write the Gospel. He's got his quill, dipping it in, and then he thinks, oh, we're supposed to remember this lady, but I can't remember what her name was. Oh, well, woman. that will just have to do. But no, in John's Gospel it's different. The woman has a name, and her name is Mary. And that's not to say that we can conflate these three stories in the three Gospels, these three particular Gospels. They may be different women. But what we can say is that in John's Gospel, it is Mary. Do you know that God knows your name and that you are held forever in the divine memory? Do you know that? There is a story in Genesis, a story that I find profoundly moving. I've preached on it here before. And it's a story about an Egyptian slave girl called Hagar. Hagar is mistreated by her mistress, Sarai. And so she runs away from her mistress into the desert. And we read in that story that the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert and said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? God calls her by name. And then at the end of the story, there's this incredible flip because Hagar then names God. She, an Egyptian, an African, Middle Eastern woman, is the first theologian according to our Bibles. She says, you are the God who sees me. That's how she names God, the God who sees me. But she would not have even been able to name God if God had not first known her name and called her by name. God calls you by name. God knows your name. Will you respond to that God that sees you? Sees you as the angel of the Lord saw Hagar. Sees you as Jesus saw Mary. We show so much love and care and acknowledge value when we call someone by their name. I remember a man at my old church. His name was Paul Archer. I remember his name because he remembered mine. He used to welcome at the door of the church, probably still does, and I was only 12 at the time. But when I came to that church, he remembered my name. He saw me. The angel of the Lord knew Hagar's name. Jesus knew Mary's. Paul Archer knew Peter Heath's name. And whose name will you learn and remember? Do you know who is here? Whose name will you learn and remember and communicate value? So why do I love this story? Because Jesus defends Mary, because the woman has a name. Why else do I love this story? Because Mary shows us how to do it. Do what? She shows us how to worship. Worship Jesus and be a disciple of Jesus. And she shows it all without saying a single word. Can you believe that? She doesn't say anything. Mary takes us right to the heart of worship. And that's important because, I'm going to say it, because a lot of worship is not worship. A lot of so-called worship is an attempt, and I'm part of this, is an attempt for you, for me, to meet a need in ourselves. In sung worship, we might seek the warm and fuzzy feelings or the uplifting feelings. In prayer, we might seek to twist God's arm or to communicate things to each other through prayer. That's what we call sometimes horizontal prayer. In our giving, we might seek to alleviate feelings of guilt and responsibility and duty. In our service in the church, we might be seeking the admiration of others. In our charity, we might actually be meeting a need to be needed. But Mary gets nothing. In fact, she probably loses her most treasured possession, a perfume worth a year's wages. Imagine this. Imagine if someone walked into our church now, they completely disrupted the sermon, and they had this briefcase, and they opened it up, and inside was cash, lots and lots of cash. Say £20,000 of cash. And then imagine if they set it on fire. And as it burnt, they lifted their hands in worship. You would think they were unwell, wouldn't you? You would. And I'm not condoning this and saying this is a good thing for us to be doing, please. But I do find it interesting because it corresponds, that picture, that image, with something that went on in the Old Testament of our Bibles. Because back then, part of worship was offering burnt sacrifices. Back then, people's wealth, it was all tied up in their animals. And so people would make animal sacrifices in recognition that it all came from God and belonged to God anyway. And so some of these animal sacrifices, they could be eaten. They could be eaten by the priests. Some of them could be eaten by worshippers and the priests. But some were burnt offerings. And these were different. They were not eaten. Instead, all that wealth, all that nutritional value was just incinerated and the smoke went up. It would rise up to God. That was how it was seen. It was devoted to God alone. You might be seeing some links, identifying some links here. So when Mary pours out her perfume on Jesus' feet, she's doing something like, perhaps, burning a briefcase of cash. She's doing something like sacrificing and burning the prized bull. She doesn't get anything from it. In fact, she loses something. Why would she do that? Why would she do that? It makes no sense. Why lose something so precious? The only way of understanding it, this strange behaviour, is if we interpret it as an outpouring of love. That's what real worship is. An outpouring of love. We ask that question, why do you go to church? Why do I go to church? What if your answer to that question was, I go to church to pour out my love to God? Wow. Now that is a reason. And of course, we don't have to go to church to do that. Certainly not. But imagine how wonderful it would be if everything that happened here was all about an outpouring of love. Before we move on to the next one, Mary also takes us straight to the heart of discipleship. Not just worship, but discipleship. And of course, they're linked. But we read that in this story, she not only pours perfume on Jesus' feet, but she also wipes his feet with her hair. That word wipe is used in the next chapter when Jesus washes his disciples' feet and wipes them. After that powerful demonstration of loving service to his disciples, Jesus says this, "You should do as I have done for you." The big idea being not that we should all wash each other's feet. We probably wouldn't like that today. But this idea that we follow Jesus by serving one another and taking the humble, the lowly tasks and jobs. So what I love about this story with Mary then is that she's preempting Jesus' act of loving service and his command to do likewise. She preempts it by washing his feet with perfume. Mary just gets it. She has this kind of spiritual intuition. It's something that I really admire. Some people just get it. There are some of these people in my life, funnily enough, I think of women in my life every time, and they just get Jesus. They just completely get Jesus, and then they follow Jesus. And it's beautiful and it's wonderful to see. Some of them are here. So Mary shows us how to do it. Worship is an outpouring of love, and discipleship is about serving one another in love. Let's go straight on, because the counterpart to Mary showing us how to do it is, of course, Judas showing us how not to do it. This might sound like a strange reason to love a story, but sometimes we learn so much from someone who has missed the point, as much from them as someone who gets it. And in this story, Judas has missed the point completely. Let's just go over what he says. He says, "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." Then the gospel writer adds this little note. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. So, we find that while Mary is willing to lose something of great worth for love, Judas would have preferred to make a profit from love. There are some verses in the Bible that are often read at weddings. Love is patient, love is kind. Heard of those before? 1 Corinthians 13. Well, imagine if 1 Corinthians 13 had been written by Judas. Ready? Love is efficient. Love is carefully controlled. Love takes a cut. Love is profitable. Love does not pour out liberally. Love objects to over-exuberant devotion. Love never serves, never sacrifices, never lets anything go to waste. Does that sound like love to you? Judas missed the point, and he stands as a warning. If we misunderstand love, we will misunderstand worship and discipleship too. And of course, we all have Mary and Judas within us. It's not, straight down the middle, good, bad. These are the good people, these are the bad people. Mary and Judas were mixed as well. We can have compassion on them and try and think about their different thoughts and intentions and motives, all the rest of it. We all have Mary and Judas within us. But the character of Judas, here's what it kind of causes me to examine it myself. How have I tried to profit from love? Where has my desire for efficiency and control blocked up the outpouring of love? What needs in myself have I tried to meet with charity? Those are some hard questions. I don't even want to ask them before you. But how about you? How about you? So why do I love this story? Because Jesus defends Mary, because the woman has a name, because Mary shows us how to do it, because Judas shows us how not to do it, and finally, because Jesus is about to pour himself out. Jesus' commentary on Mary's outpouring of love is crystal clear. He says it was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. And Jesus is looking at the bigger picture, talking about his imminent death. He will be lifted up on a cross, and his life, his love will be poured out for the salvation of the world. But there's an even bigger picture, because Mary's outpouring of love and Jesus' outpouring of love is in the context of a God who is always pouring out love. In our opening verses from Isaiah, we heard of how God provided water in the wilderness, streams in the wasteland for his people and animals. In the psalm that Natasha read earlier, there was this prayer, "Restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev." The Negev is this rocky desert, so the image is similar. God is the one who pours, who waters the desert. And of course, Hagar found the angel of the Lord by a stream in the desert. God pours. God pours to sustain us. And we could say that there is an even bigger picture than that, because within God, there is already an eternal, productive overflow of love and the eternal comings forth of the Son and the Spirit from the source, the Father. It's a very theological kind of way of putting it, but the big idea is that God is always pouring forth. And so Jesus' decision to pour himself out is a participation in what God has always done and who God always is. And this is what Mary is responding to in her outpouring of love. She's participating in the outpouring. She's anticipating the outpouring. And so our outpouring of love, it's nothing but a participation in a story that is participating in a bigger story, that is participating in an even bigger story. Mary found her place in that. Will you find your place in that? Will you find your place in this multi-layered epic of love that God has set in motion and will forever sustain? Will you find your place in this story, this bigger story and bigger story and bigger story? The Apostle Paul, he found his place in the story. He wrote in his letter to the Philippians this: "I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them rubbish, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ." And so, just as Mary let go of her perfume to participate in the outpouring of love, Paul let go of all his reasons to boast in order to gain Christ and be found in him, to participate in his sufferings. Elsewhere in the letter, Paul talks about rejoicing as he pours himself out in service for and with the Philippians. Paul understood that he was participating in a much bigger story. Worship is an outpouring of love. I'm coming to close here. Worship is an outpouring of love. Discipleship is about serving one another in love. And both will cost us dearly, all of us. And that cost, it will seem nonsensical if we don't understand the context, the big story that Jesus poured himself out in love, that God is always pouring out in love, and that love is always overflowing within the Trinity. And we can participate in that today. And Paul rejoiced in that. Mary, no doubt, rejoiced in that. It's a reason to rejoice. And it's what we're made for. It's going according to the grain, going with the grain of who we are. God has formed us for God's self. to love and be loved. So there you go. Why do I love this story? Because Jesus defends Mary, because the woman has a name, because Mary shows us how to do it, because Judas shows us how not to do it, and finally, because Jesus is about to pour himself out. As I invite Mike and Natasha back, hear these words.